Clara, my dear, Arthur's voice cut through the cocktail chatter, amplified by the high ceilings. Your career is truly taking off. It's a shame your husband's aspirations remain so contained. He turned to Ethan, a patronizing smile etched deep. Some men, after all, are simply not built for the fast lane, are they? Just not enough ambition. My face burned. The polished ballroom floor seemed to tilt, revealing the chasm I'd tried to bridge. My hands were still a little shaky, even hours after the gala ended. I remembered getting ready, pulling the whipper up on my dress, the silk cool against my skin. 4 years I'd put into Pinnacle investments. 4 years of late nights and early mornings, all with the director position in mind. Tonight was supposed to be a step forward, another chance to show my commitment. The annual gala was always a spectacle of polished ambition, a place where futures were quietly negotiated over lukewarm champagne. Ethan had agreed to come for me. He was a high school history teacher, coached wrestling at Roosevelt High. He didn't care for these kinds of events, for the small talk or the performative networking. Only coming for the free booze and to see the look on Arthur Thorne's face, he'd quipped earlier, adjusting his tie in the hall mirror. He smiled, that easy, genuine smile of his, and for a moment I felt a flicker of relief. He could make light of anything. Ethan was brilliant, truly. He could connect the dots between ancient civilizations and today's headlines in a way that made you see the world differently. He didn't chase money or status. He pursued understanding, relationships. His ambition ran deep, but it wasn't the kind Arthur Thorne understood. Ethan had been a college athlete, a wrestler, sturdy and quiet in his strength. He built things, cultivated things, whether it was a garden or a young mind. He grounded me in a way the high-rise offices of Pinnacle never could. Arthur Thorne, on the other hand, was all about elevation, Harvard MBA, inherited wealth, a life curated for maximum impact. He valued what was visible, the right car, the right address, the right watch. He'd built Pinnacle, or at least inherited the foundation and expanded it, making sure everyone knew whose name was on the building. Our worlds were fundamentally different, and I had worked hard to keep them separate. Tonight, however, the lines were about to blur. They were about to collide, right there under the glittering chandeliers of the grand ballroom. We arrived a little after 7, the room already buzzing with the clink of glasses and the murmur of conversation. Ethan immediately gravitated towards the bar, scanning the labels. I saw Arthur Thorne across the room, talking to a senator, his laugh echoing a little too loudly. I took a deep breath. It wasn't long before he detached himself, making a beeline for us, his wife Brenda trailing a step behind, her smile as fixed as Arthur's own. My stomach tightened, a familiar knot forming just below my ribs. "Clara!" Arthur boomed, extending a hand to me, then turned his gaze to Ethan. His eyes took Ethan in, head to toe, lingering for a fraction of a second too long. "So this is the famous Ethan," he said, his voice carrying a subtle, almost imperceptible lilt of dismissal. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of observation, an assessment. I felt the knot pull tighter. "Arthur," I said, trying to keep my voice even, "this is my husband, Ethan. Ethan, this is my boss, Arthur Thorne, and his wife, Brenda." The introductions felt stilted, formal. Ethan offered a polite nod and a small, practiced smile. Arthur, without missing a beat, let his gaze flick down to Ethan's left wrist, then back up to his face. There was no watch, just the bare skin of his forearm. "History teacher, right?" Arthur asked, his tone shifting, becoming a little too casual, a little too knowing. "At what school again?" The condescension was clear, a sharp edge beneath the smooth surface of his words. He knew where Ethan taught. He made it a point to know everything about his employees, especially their perceived weaknesses. Ethan's face remained impassive. He took a slow sip of his bourbon. "Roosevelt High," he replied, his voice calm, steady. He didn't rise to the bait, not overtly. Arthur chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He turned back to me briefly, then to Brenda. "Roosevelt High. Ah, yes." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air, then waved a dismissive hand. "Admirable work, truly. A man of the people." The words were delivered with a smirk, a thinly veiled jab at the modest pay, at a life that wasn't about high finance or climbing corporate ladders. My jaw clenched. I squeezed Ethan's forearm, my fingers pressing against the solid muscle. It was an involuntary gesture, a small signal to him, though I knew he'd already recognized Arthur's game. Arthur's eyes, bright and quick, darted between Ethan and me, taking in my subtle warning, processing it. He was a predator, always circling, testing boundaries. Ethan, however, remained unperturbed. He took another slow sip of his bourbon. "The compensation isn't just financial," he stated, his voice even, not loud, but firm enough to carry over the background hum. He looked directly at Arthur, no challenge in his gaze, just a simple declaration of fact. Arthur let out a short, dry chuckle, a sound like rustling paper. Of course," he patronized, waving a dismissive hand. "The moral rewards, the intrinsic value. Very admirable, Ethan." He didn't mean it. The words were laced with an invisible syrup designed to coat and then suffocate. Then Arthur shifted his focus, turning his sharp gaze back to me. "Speaking of rewards, Clara," he began, his tone changing, becoming more businesslike. "The director position. We're still deliberating, of course." My heart sank. I knew what was coming. "Chad Miller is quite keen, as you know. Young, hungry." Chad was Arthur's golf buddy's nephew, fresh out of some second-tier MBA program, with a fraction of my experience. The injustice of it was a cold weight in my stomach. I forced a professional smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm sure you'll make the right decision based on performance metrics," I replied, choosing my words carefully. It was a subtle challenge, a reminder of the quantitative data, the hard numbers that spoke to my 4 years of consistent over-delivery. Arthur's smile tightened, becoming a thin, uncomfortable line. He didn't like being reminded of inconvenient facts, especially not in front of others. "Performance is just one factor, Clara," he said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more serious. "Leadership, true leadership, requires a certain presence, an understanding of the world. Not just the numbers, but the ecosystem." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air, a silent judgment against everything Ethan represented. Ethan, who had been listening quietly, tilted his head slightly. His eyes, though steady, held a glint I recognized, a quiet sharpness. "And what world is that exactly, Arthur?" he asked, his voice light, almost genuinely curious. It sounded like a simple question, but it was a needle point, aimed right at Arthur's carefully constructed facade. Arthur's mouth stretched into something resembling a shark-like grin, wide and cold. "Our world, Ethan," he clarified, his gaze sweeping across the room, encompassing the expensive suits, the diamonds, the carefully cultivated air of success. "Our clients, they expect a certain caliber of people managing their assets, people who understand their language, their lifestyle. It's about trust, connections, a shared understanding of what truly matters." He spoke as if these were universal truths, unquestionable and self-evident. The tension in the air was palpable now. Conversations around us had dimmed, a few heads subtly turning. Other executives, sensing a developing spectacle, began to drift closer, pretending to examine a nearby art piece or refill a drink, but their ears were clearly tuned to our exchange. They watched, some with thinly veiled amusement, others with a hint of discomfort. Ethan took another measured sip of his drink. He looked at Arthur, then around the room, taking in the observing faces. His voice was still light, almost conversational, but his eyes were steady, unwavering. "Must be nice managing other people's billions," he mused, a soft irony in his tone. He paused, then added, "Though teaching 30 teenagers not to be is its own kind of wealth management, I suppose." A few nervous chuckles broke the momentary silence, quickly stifled. The air shifted slightly, a subtle acknowledgement of Ethan's unexpected wit. Arthur's strained smile finally faltered, replaced by a momentary flash of irritation. He regained control quickly, but the perfect composure had been fractured. "Yes," Arthur said, nodding stiffly. "Different worlds entirely, it seems." His voice was sharper now, a clear dismissal. Arthur, sensing the shift in the room, the subtle tension, decided to escalate. He turned his body slightly, addressing the cluster of executives and their spouses who had gathered, drawn by the unusual exchange. He swept his hand towards Ethan, a performative gesture. "Ethan here teaches history at a public school, you know," he announced, his voice carrying easily. "Quite the contrast to our daily battles in the financial trenches, eh?" He chuckled, inviting the others to join him in a shared moment of superior amusement. My face burned. I felt the heat rising in my cheeks, a tide of embarrassment and anger washing over me. I wanted to disappear, or better yet, to scream. This wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It was about me, my career, my carefully constructed image. Brenda Thorne, Arthur's wife, a woman whose smile usually never wavered, leaned in, a worried frown creasing her brow. "Arthur, Senator Peterson just arrived," she murmured, a gentle attempt to pull him back from the edge. But Arthur merely waved her off, his attention fixed on Ethan, enjoying the spotlight. He wasn't done. Warming to his impromptu audience, he continued to prod, to bait Ethan about his career choice. The amusement in his eyes was cold and sharp. "Tell me, Ethan," he pressed, "what's the most challenging part of your day, really? Breaking up fights in the hallway, or trying to explain why ancient civilizations matter when these kids could be learning to code? Getting them to appreciate the intricacies of, say, the Peloponnesian War when they're all just thinking about TikTok?" The room fell silent. Even the nervous chuckles from before died out. It was an uncomfortable, brittle silence. Colleagues exchanged glances, some looking away, some at their shoes, recognizing the line Arthur had not just crossed, but vaulted over. It was a public humiliation, plain and simple, a deliberate act of diminishment. My hand clenched into a fist, my nails digging into my palm. I was about to speak, to inject some desperately needed professionalism into the situation, to deflect, to apologize for Arthur's boorishness. But before I could form the words, Ethan smiled. Not his polite, reserved smile. This was his genuine, crinkling-eyed smile, the one that reached his thoughtful eyes, the one that meant he was about to say something quietly devastating. He lowered his glass, his gaze steady on Arthur. "Actually, Arthur," Ethan began, his voice calm, conversational, belying the sharp edge beneath it. "The hardest part is teaching kids about historical examples of power and hubris without making it obvious I'm talking about people like you." A collective, shocked silence descended upon the group. It hung in the air, thick and heavy, for a full second. Then a few stifled laughs broke the quiet, quickly suppressed, like coughs in a library. A ripple went through the onlookers, a wave of subtle, nervous energy. Some faces betrayed open shock, others a flicker of admiration. Arthur's face, usually so composed, flushed a deep scarlet. His jaw went slack for a moment, then snapped shut. He sputtered, caught completely off guard. "Excuse me," he blustered, his voice rising, betraying the crack in his polished veneer. Ethan merely raised his glass slightly, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. A salute. His eyes held Arthur's. "Just making conversation, Arthur," he retorted, his voice still level, almost innocent. "But since we're comparing careers, I've always wondered, what's it like having your self-worth entirely dependent on the size of your year-end bonus?" The question hung in the air, a perfectly aimed barb, hitting precisely where it hurt the most. Arthur's jaw clenched, a muscle working visibly in his cheek. He opened his mouth, then closed it, struggling for a response that would regain control of the situation, but the words seemed to fail him. His eyes darted around, looking for an escape, for a way to salvage his authority. "I don't think you understand the complexity and importance of what we do here, young man," he finally sputtered, his voice tighter, less assured than before. Ethan, remarkably, remained unruffled. He finished the last of his whiskey, the ice clinking softly in the empty glass. "Oh, I understand perfectly," he replied, his voice still that same quiet, steady tone. "You move imaginary money around on screens to make more imaginary money, occasionally crashing real economies and walking away unscathed. Very complex, indeed." He paused, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "It's a unique form of alchemy, I'll grant you that." A wave of fear, cold and sharp, washed over me at the potential career fallout. My director promotion, the one I'd worked 4 years for, felt suddenly very distant. But beneath that fear, a different emotion swelled, hot and fierce: pride. I watched Ethan standing there, unassuming yet utterly defiant, defending not just himself, but defending us, defending the integrity I sometimes felt compromised by this world. It was a dangerous, exhilarating feeling. Arthur, his face still flushed, turned his icy gaze on me. His voice dropped, becoming a low, dangerous growl. "Clara, perhaps you should escort your husband outside for some air. He seems overwrought." It was a direct order, a public reprimand designed to put me back in my place, to assert his dominance over both of us. Ethan, however, didn't flinch. He just offered a small, polite shake of his head. "I'm feeling great, actually," he said, setting his empty glass on a passing tray. He then looked around the room, his eyes twinkling. "But we should mingle. Lots of interesting people here tonight. Wouldn't want to monopolize Arthur's time." Then, to my surprise, he turned directly to Brenda Thorne, Arthur's wife, who stood silently beside her husband, her face a mask of polite discomfort. His expression was genuine, free of sarcasm. "Mrs. Thorne," Ethan said, "a pleasure to meet you. Your husband has told us absolutely nothing about you, which seems a shame." He offered her a warm, authentic smile, a stark contrast to Arthur's earlier sneering remarks. Brenda's eyes widened slightly, a faint blush rising in her cheeks. With that, Ethan reached for my hand, his fingers closing around mine, firm and reassuring. He gave a gentle tug. "Come on, Clara," he said, his voice just for me. And then he led me away from the stunned silence, away from the furious, sputtering Arthur Thorne, who stood abandoned and fuming in the center of a small, now very quiet circle of onlookers. Once we were a safe distance, tucked behind a pillar near a potted palm, out of earshot from Arthur's wrath, I turned to Ethan, my voice a low hiss. "Ethan, that was necessary?" The question was edged with a mix of disbelief and exasperation, even a hint of admiration I wasn't ready to admit. He stopped, his grip on my hand tightening slightly. His eyes met mine, steady and unwavering. "Nobody talks to you or me like that," he replied, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "Not even your boss." I felt a fresh wave of panic. "You don't understand," I whispered urgently, looking back toward Arthur, who was now being quietly ushered away by Brenda. "Arthur holds grudges. He's vindictive. He's already on the fence about my promotion. And now..." I trailed off, the implications looming large and cold. Ethan interrupted my spiraling thoughts, his voice cutting through my anxieties like a clean blade. "And now what?" he asked, his grip still firm on my hand. "He'll punish you because your husband wouldn't kiss his ring? If that's the case, Clara, this isn't a place you want to advance in anyway." His words were a mirror, reflecting an uncomfortable truth I had pushed down for too long. Deep down in the quiet, honest part of me, I knew he was right. I knew the kind of place Pinnacle truly was, the kind of man Arthur was. But 4 years of my life poured into this. All those late nights, all the sacrifices. The idea of letting it go, of starting over, was a heavy weight in my chest. I sighed a long, weary exhalation. "Let's just try to salvage the evening," I suggested, forcing a lightness I didn't feel. But the damage was done. For the rest of the night, every time I caught Arthur's eye across the room, his gaze was hard, angry. It was a promise of retribution. I watched him whisper into Mr. Hayes' ear, the CEO himself, a man whose word was absolute. Mr. Hayes, a stoic figure, listened, then his eyes flicked to Ethan and me, a fleeting, assessing glance. My stomach twisted. The sense of dread solidified into a cold, hard knot. I felt exposed, marked. Stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold and how they reshape everything. Monday morning, the inevitable news arrived. I saw it in the hushed tones of my colleagues, the averted gazes. Chad Miller, the promotion was his. The confirmation came through an email, short and formal, requesting my presence in Arthur's office at 10. I walked down the polished hall, each step feeling heavy, into Arthur's office. The door clicked shut behind me. Arthur sat behind his imposing mahogany desk, his expression a careful mask of professional regret, but his eyes held a glint of something else, a thinly veiled satisfaction. Claire, he began, gesturing for me to sit, though I remained standing. I'm afraid the committee has decided to go with Chad for the director position. He paused, letting the words sink in. They felt Chad had a better grasp of our corporate culture. Fitting in is just as important as performance metrics, Clara. I hope you understand that now. He leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, deliberate movement. I nodded stiffly, my voice even, though my throat felt tight. I understand, sir. Is there anything specific you feel I could improve on? I asked. A faint hope for constructive feedback, for a professional path forward, even now. Arthur smiled, a thin, cold line. Judgment, Clara. Judgment is a key quality we look for in leadership. That includes personal associations. The company we keep reflects upon us, wouldn't you agree? The implication was clear, sharp, undeniable. I was being punished, not for my work, but for Ethan. For Ethan's defiance, for his refusal to conform, for my choice of a partner. Perfectly clear, sir, I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. I kept my face blank, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing my hurt or anger. Arthur's cold smile widened just a fraction. Oh, and one more thing, Clara. Chad will need your help transitioning into his new role. I told him you'd be happy to train him. The rest of that Monday I spent in a fog. Rage and humiliation churned in my stomach, a potent, bitter concoction. I went through the motions, cleared my desk, transferred my files, all under the pretense of preparing for Chad's arrival. Each click of the mouse, each folded document, felt like another small infuriating surrender. The hours crawled by. That night, home alone, the quiet of the house was too loud. Ethan was still at wrestling practice. I started chopping vegetables for dinner, the rhythmic thud of the knife against the cutting board a temporary outlet for my frustration. But the rage simmered, finally boiling over. When Ethan walked in, the smell of liniment and sweat clinging to him, I just broke. The words tumbled out, fast and furious, the humiliation fresh and raw. I told him everything, the exact words, the tone, Arthur's smug face. He actually said that about personal associations? Ethan asked, his voice dangerously quiet, a tone I knew well. It meant his thoughts were deep, calculating. Not in so many words, no, I confirmed, slamming the knife down on a carrot with unnecessary force. The carrot split with a sharp crack. But the message was crystal clear. My choices, my life outside Pinnacle, reflect on his precious corporate culture. I recounted my 4 years of exceptional performance, the clients I'd brought in, the successful acquisitions I'd managed, all of it meaning absolutely nothing because Ethan, my husband, had dared to stand up to Arthur, dared to call him out. Ethan walked over to the counter, his presence calm and solid. Without a word, he gently took the knife from my hand. His fingers brushed mine, and the brief contact was enough to steady me, just slightly before I could hurt myself or the counter. He set the knife down, then turned to face me fully. What do you want to do? He asked, his eyes soft, searching mine. I leaned against the cool countertop, the fight draining out of me, replaced by a hollow ache. I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. Part of me wants to quit spectacularly. Part of me wants to stick it out, to prove him wrong, make him regret it. And part of me wants to just burn the whole place down. The last words were spoken with a ferocity that surprised even me. Ethan was quiet for a moment, picking up the knife and thoughtfully continuing the chopping where I'd left off, his movements precise and even. The rhythmic sound was almost meditative. The kitchen was filled only with the faint smell of garlic and the soft thud of the knife. What if there was a fourth option? He finally asked, his gaze still on the cutting board, but his meaning clear. I pushed myself off the counter, my weariness replaced by a flicker of curiosity, a faint spark of something new. I'm listening, I said, my voice hushed. He looked up then, meeting my eyes. A faint, knowing smile played on his lips. What if we orchestrated a little lesson in hubris for Arthur? The way he said it, so calm, so matter-of-fact, sent a shiver down my spine. I hadn't known then, standing there in my kitchen, the full extent of Ethan's quiet network, the subtle threads he could pull. I didn't know that Arthur Thorne, for all his perceived power, had utterly underestimated the man he'd so carelessly dismissed. The plan would unfold so perfectly, so precisely, that looking back, it would seem almost inevitable. Ethan's brother-in-law, David Whitman, a tech journalist for the Wall Street Journal, always hungry for a story about corporate malfeasance. His college roommate, Senator William Reed, now a powerful figure on the Senate Banking Committee, a man who believed in accountability. And Maya Lin, a former student, now running a wildly popular finance blog with an army of dedicated readers, always looking for a good takedown. Arthur Thorne thought he was untouchable. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. Arthur Thorne thought he held all the cards, that his wealth and position made him untouchable. He believed he could diminish Ethan, and by extension, me, with casual cruelty and professional sabotage. What he didn't grasp was that true power isn't about inherited money or a corner office. It's about connections forged through genuine respect, loyalty earned over years, and a deep understanding of human nature. He saw a high school teacher. He missed the strategist, the mentor, the man with a network built on substance, not superficiality. His arrogance blinded him, preventing him from seeing the quiet strength he'd provoked. The lesson in hubris was coming, orchestrated by a man he deemed inconsequential, and it would dismantle his carefully constructed world brick by agonizing brick. He'd learned that some different worlds are far more powerful than his own.